RItchie. Chuck is a teacher of Russian history and speaks Russian fluently and has been to Russia, well, just 45 times.
Or 47, I don't remember. I can't count that high. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the reason that this came about is I could tell people were very interested about this topic and about the Ukraine and refugees because of all the money raised for the walk and that the youth did around the track. And so John Sweeney said, well, you know, Chuck has an interesting take on that. And that is something that we're going to delve into today. Chuck, with his trips of probably 47 times to the Soviet Union, I think looks at this conflict perhaps a little bit differently than we do, because we see the refugee pictures, and of course we see the devastation of war, and those pictures are really unforgiving, I think.
I was just looking at a particular article. I follow BBC. They have it's called BBC Glavna. It's in Russian, and it's one way that I keep the right. But the images and the documentation of the atrocities, and there's no other way to explain it, that have happened at the hands of civilians and children. There was a picture of the basement in Bucha where they had literally tortured and killed the children. I mean, it's a side of, how do I put this? It's a side of the Russian character that it baffles me. Because, and for me, the conflict is that there's another side to the Russian. And people come up and they say, well, how do you deal with this? And I keep going back to a very old adage. I keep trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And Putin is not Russia. Russia is so much bigger than Putin. And you know this, and what the Russians have given to us in terms of world culture, world literature. I was just talking with a group that went to the museum the other day, the Trinitarians, and they had pilmeni for lunch. Pilmeni is a Russian dish. It's my favorite dish. My favorite piece of music is Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini by Rachmaninoff. My favorite book is Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. What Russia has done to enrich my life has just been unbelievable. And yet, you look at those pictures, and you almost have to do a little Orwellian double think, you know, to be able to deal with it. So my own personal way of dealing with this whole thing is that I keep looking at the good side. I keep looking, you know, you look at the icons that we were looking at today. Everywhere I can find good things, but my heart just breaks for what's happening.
And of course, Putin is trying to restore a grandeur of Russia back from the early, at least 1800s, 1900s, probably
even beyond that.
Yeah.
That's Putin's worldview is got his head turned back looking at the past. And that's his whole orientation. And basically, his mission, as he sees it, is to restore the Russian Empire. Well, what's the Russian Empire? The core of the Russian Empire is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. Why? Because they are all Slavic. That is the heart of the Russian Empire. And I really believe that in Putin's mind, he can't restore that empire without Ukraine. And so we have a war that only he seems to be able to understand.
And you see with the map, and we know this, that the area that we're talking about is huge. It is huge. There was a question yesterday at Caribou, which is, what is the biggest landmass forestation of trees? And we know the answer to be Russia. So, it's not only restoring that, but it's also got rich resources.
Well, yeah, if you look at, I'm still trying to figure out what Putin really wants. I think what he wanted is and probably wishes that he had gone blitzkrieg, which he didn't. But I think he wants Ukraine as a sovereign nation to be back under the fold. And of course, what you see up there in the darker color is what he has so far. And of course, the Donbass is a rich mineral, a source of minerals. The Lugansk is a agricultural area. But the most important thing, in Crimea, for me, that's another story. Khrushchev gave that away. Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Ukrainians. But the real problem is that if they get to Odessa and they can block the exit out of the Black Sea, no matter how much grain Ukraine produces, they've got multi-problems in trying to get it to market if they can't use the Black Sea and access to the sea. And I'm sure you've seen the headlines. I mean, there are people predicting that there's going to be a real consequence on the world food market because Ukraine is not able to produce. If they're planting, God, I don't know how they're doing it, but they're planting. But even if they plant and grow, the question is, how do they get it to market? So that's something we're just going to have to wait and see on.
We talk about Russia and your love for Russia, but also Russians live in the Ukraine as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And a lot of Russians and Ukrainians can't understand this. It's like fighting with your brother or your sister. And because there has been a close affinity. One example, you go back to 988, and Vladimir, who was the Tsar of Russia at the time, that is the time and the place when Christianity came to Russia, through Kiev. There was no Kiev state. It was all Russia. And then as you get to more modern times and the Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the 15 republics, but it wasn't until 1991 when they actually became a sovereign state of their own. And what I've found interesting in my own experience, I've always thought of the Russians and the Ukrainians as very similar. Not much difference between them, except for one major factor that's come to light through this war. And that is that the Ukrainians they have what I would call the spirit of 1776 in their breasts. They want freedom. They want to be free. The Russians, on the other hand, it's not in their DNA. And, there's I want to see if I can do this without having to do much. When I was teaching, I had a list of 9 themes of Russian history. And one of those themes, excuse me, where did it go? One of the themes it has to do with freedom versus security, okay? The Ukrainians want freedom, but listen to this is by Andrei Amalrik. He was the author of a book called Will the Soviet Union Survive Till 1984? He writes, whether because of historical traditions or for some other reason, the ideas of self-government, of equality before the law, of personal freedom, and the responsibility that goes with these are almost completely incomprehensible to the Russian people. Even in the idea of pragmatic freedom, a Russian tends to see not so much the possibility of securing a good life for himself as the danger that some clever fellow will make good at his expense. To the majority of people, the very word freedom is synonymous with disorder. or the opportunity to indulge with impunity in some kind of antisocial or dangerous activity. And I keep going back to this because it reminds me, first of all, there is no history of freedom and democracy. So to think that that's going to suddenly come into being on its own, I'm not convinced that it's going to happen. What surprises me about the Ukrainians is they get it. And if you read about the war, to me, the only thing that's encouraging and uplifting is the way in which the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people have responded. But as far as the Russians, it's a very different mentality.
That 1776 mentality is pretty incredible. I mean, you can almost feel it when you hear and when you see the pictures. And their zest, like almost they will do whatever it takes. They don't care. They will go in and die themselves.
But one of the things that if you read some of the commentary, people predicting how the war is going, one of the differences, major differences, is the morale of the Ukrainian army versus the morale of the Russian army. And the Russian army, my favorite story, when the war first started, there was a young man, he was probably 18 or 19 years old, he was captured. And Ukrainian soldiers were interviewing him. I mean, this came out in the press and was on the internet, the whole thing. And they said, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, this is a military training operation. Well, why are you carrying a loaded weapon? Oh, we don't shoot at anybody. And they said, did anybody shoot at you? No. Well, why are you here? And he says, it's just an operation. And then at the end of the interview, the soldier said, what's your mother's name? And he gave him the mother's name, and he handed the Russian soldier a telephone. And he said, call your mom and tell her that you're okay. If that is any indication of the way in which the Ukrainians approach this war, it's not only filled with the spirit of subject, it's creative. I mean, I love that story. But the most frustrating part of this is nobody knows how it's going to end. You know, for all of the valor and what the Ukrainians have shown us so far, we don't know. We just don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah, I heard the ambassador to the Ukraine in an interview, and he thinks the Ukrainians are going to win because of that spirit and because of Russia underestimating. But then you have, the battle like Mariupol, and that was very, very difficult.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
And yeah, he does, if he controls the area up there that he does, even without Kharkov, it's going to put a real monkey wrench in the machinery, let's put it that way. Well.
Yeah. I want to hear some of your thoughts and maybe some questions. We have a couple more places and things that I want to talk about, but let's hear from you. Ben Benson.
You've talked a little bit before, but you've been in Russia so many times. Tell us about how the people of Russia are getting information.
It's pretty easy, but for those of us who went to the Museum of Russian Art on Thursday with the Trinitarians, there is one of the caricatures, political cartoons, shows, there's a exhibit of Say No to War, it's called. And in it shows, maybe 15 people there's a big television set on their head, and they're scrunched on the ground, and the television set has just rammed their head into the ground. And what it so cleverly signifies is that their heads have been filled with Russian television. propaganda, and it's all pro-Putin. There are Echo Moscow, which was a radio station, Dozhd, which was another outlet. All of the and there were only two, they've been closed down. So there is no other version other than the internet, and they're working hard to block that as much as they can too. So you get to the point where there are, and I've heard stories, I'm working with a young couple from Dagestan who are here trying to get settled. And this young man, his name is, this young man calls his mother and his family back home, and they try to have a conversation of what's going on. And the parents back home don't believe the Ukrainian side of it. They believe that that Russia is perfectly justified, to the point where he can't talk to his parents anymore. And I've heard that story over and over. And what it does, it tells you, first of all, how effective Russian propaganda is. And number two, there's reasons for it. And again, if you take the Soviet mentality, in Russia, to survive, what you want to do is you want to be a part of the majority. You want to think like everybody else thinks. You don't want to be coming up with something that's a little different. The best example of which today is this term foreign agent, okay? All you have to do is be labeled as a foreign agent, and that means somebody who has dealt with the West or who has been financed by the West. And you're out, okay? They've even got to the point where if you use the word war, you are susceptible to being arrested and going to jail. So in that kind of an atmosphere, you're not going to come up and start questioning, what are we doing here? And if you really want to look good, what you do is you join the band, okay? If you get a chance to look at the New York Times this morning, there is a large, wonderful article on
Kirill.
On Kirill.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even Kirill, the Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, he's in the pocket. He's in the pocket. And that's not surprising. Stalin had the Russian Orthodox Church in his pocket as well. So when you ask about how Russian people are thinking, if you can get into one of those kitchen discussions with them, with a little vodka and some good food, they might tell you if they trusted you. But there are a lot of people who genuinely believe that what they're doing is the right thing, because they don't see what we see. They don't get the information that we do.
Yeah. And there are studies, like Chuck was saying, that when you're in a situation, even where we are, say you're in a crowd and the majority of the people are saying, yeah, that's what I think. How likely are you to say, well, I just disagree with you? You're probably just going to go with what's popular.
Yes, I just was wondering if the Ukrainians are Christian people or a different religion, and same with the Russian people.
Yes and no. Is their Christianity the same as Russia's? There is a Russian Orthodox Church. There is also a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has split. They have removed themselves from the auspices of the Russian Orthodox, and Kirill, who would be basically the head of the Russian Orthodox movement. And of course, that's another point of contention, to be sure. But basically, they are Orthodox, Russian, but I'll have difficulty telling you what the difference of theology is. But the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has clearly separated itself. It has seceded from Russian Orthodoxy, which was the major religion.
Yeah, and what the article was saying this morning in the New York Times was that the priest has said that, they're trying to spread liberalism in the Ukraine, and we should be against that. He apparently had a meeting with Pope Francis, and it was a little difficult. Pope Francis said, I think you need to stay out of state affairs.
No, well, the way he said it is our role is not to be an altar boy to the political leaders. And it was very well stated.
Good job, Pope Francis.
Thank you, Chuck. You're so informative. But in your opinion, what will happen in this whole mess if something happens to Putin?
Okay, well, I thought you were just going to leave it without if something happens to Putin, because there is nobody, and I have not found anybody that is willing to predict what's going to happen if Putin's still around. I don't think Putin gets out of this one myself, but what happens after him? Well, I have to be honest, I'm probably more pessimistic than I am optimistic for a couple of reasons. Number one, Russia has had two very clear chances, one in 1917 and then again in 1991, to have thrown off the shackles, if you will, of their own history and to take a different course. And in neither case, in 1917, when communism came in, it was just another version of a authoritarian, totalitarian system of government. In 1991, they had a chance, and in part, this is not the only reason, but in part, what happened is that there was a rape of the country in terms of the oligarchs who got in and had got most of the businesses, the companies became rich, and that has become a self-serving kind of thing. If you take Putin out of it, what is left is still a system. And it's a system that it's a straight hierarchy. And Russians, if you're a manager in a company here and the president is up here, there are very few decisions that you are going to make on your own until you go up this ladder. Everything depends on pushing it up the ladder. And along with that is a system of greed and a system of corruption that is everybody gets to lace their pockets according to their level. And so if you take Putin out of the picture, nothing's going to change unless somehow they can change that structure, that pattern of government. And I'm pessimistic in the sense that it's just so pervasive. Ironically enough, it's not to say, though, that I got to tell you, one of the dearest people in my life was a woman by the name of Olga Fleshler, and as Russian as you can be. And I can't think of a better representation of humanity than this woman. This is what's so hard about it. These people are absolutely wonderful at heart, but they're in a circumstance, and I don't know how you break that system.
Chuck, yesterday you described how the oligarchs ended up purchasing, was it coupons? And how that occurred, that change.
Well, what happened is that when our economist, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard University, went over and was advising Gaidar and others about how you do this, and so he come up with the idea of selling vouchers. So you and I, anybody on the street, could buy a voucher for a share in this company, what have you. Well, of course, 99% of the Russians on the street had no idea what this voucher was, but the smart people knew what it was. So what they did is they went around and they would go to you and they would say, I'll buy your vouchers for, 2 rubles a voucher, or 10 or whatever, for a pittance, for a song. And of course, by the time they have purchased how many thousands, they suddenly end up in control. And then it moves from there. And again, it feeds into the system of corruption. So that's a move that I've never understood. And there was the slogan was 500 days, that they were going to become a market system in 500 days. Taking a capitalist system, a command system. I'm not an economist, so maybe I've missed something in there.
Chuck, I did want to ask you where your passion for Russia came from.
I was a student at the Blake School, 12-year school. I flunked my junior year. And the headmaster called me and said, Chuck, you got a choice. You can find a new school or you can repeat your junior year. I said, I'll repeat. In order to do that, I had to take courses to fill up, and I liked language, so by the time I graduated, I had 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Spanish, 2 years of French, and a year of German. And I love languages. I go to college, I go to Dartmouth College, and the first thing I do is sign up for a course called Russian Civilization. I knew nothing about Russia. I didn't know there was even a revolution. It was as though I went down the list and said, hey, I'll take that one. Turns out it was a hot ticket professor by the name of Charles McLean. And it was the course was Russia from 1917 to the present day. I fell in love with it, the whole thing. So I majored in Russian civilization. Had 2 years of Russian with Mrs. Morozov. She was the toughest teacher I have ever studied under. I got C's, okay? I graduate, I go into the Army wanting to go to the Army language school to take Russian. I got into the Army language school and I got Korean. So I went to Korea and I was fluent in Korean and had a great time in Korea. Came back and through a very strange circumstance, in the middle of the school year at Blake, through the death of one of my teachers, they asked if I would come and start teaching Russian because the Russian teacher had to take the Latin courses of this professor of mine that had died. So in 1964, I started out with 2 years of Russian. When the kids were on page 25, I was on page 30 in the textbook. One thing led to another, but the thing that really hooked me was, at the end of my senior year, I got a job on the Tolstoy farm in Nyack, New York. This is Tolstoy's youngest daughter, Alexandra Lvovna, Sasha, as they called her. And they have a summer camp for Russian emigre kids whose parents want them to keep up their language and their culture. And there was a Russian Orthodox church. We went to church twice a day, 3 hours on Sunday. I mean, it was an experience. But one night, we're sitting with the kids in Alexandra Lvovna, and we watch War and Peace with Mel Ferrer and Audrey Hepburn. Our version, not their 10-hour version, but our version. And afterwards, we sit around with Alexandra Lvovna talking, and I'm literally sitting there pinching myself and saying, Chuck, this is Tolstoy's daughter. I'd read all of his stuff in English, of course, I think it was at that point that the Russians have an expression, they say, yeah, попал на крючок. I fell on the hook. And I decided at that point I was going to figure out how to speak Russian, and one thing led to another.
And if you came in a little late, he has been to Russia, we think 47 times.
Don't hold me to that.
Yeah. So, one thing I guess I think about in closing is just, our passions bring us a lot of joy. But God gave us brains and emotions, and sometimes worlds collide. And I think, what I know as a Christian is we're called to love people. And sometimes we need to look beyond the circumstances, depending on the circumstances people are in. We don't know what we would do. We can see what's happening. We know it affects us, and goodness sakes, it affects our pocketbook. It's even worse. So I think that just leaves us with a little something to think about.
Before we end, and you gave us a signal that we were ending, but I just wanted to say about Chuck. This is a personal story. He's been an educator for a long, long time. You can tell just by the way he spoke to the kids this morning. And in 1995, we had a foreign exchange student come to us from Russia. His name is Stas Tanigan. And he was with an exchange program, and he went to Orono High School for a year, and we absolutely fell in love with him. He became a member of the family. The kids liked him. He was a contemporary. Well, he was the youngest one. We call him the baby of the family. But the grandmothers loved him. Everybody loved him. And he was turning in his house key. He was about to go back to Russia. And we said, no, you keep that house key, and you're welcome here anytime you come back. You know, you're a member of the family. And so he did go back to Russia, and within 2 weeks, and it takes a letter, about 2 weeks to get from Russia, we got a letter saying, can I come back? And I said, well, you just got home. You better give it some time, just to reconnect with your friends and your family, and I'll call you in a month. Well, in another month or so, he still wanted to come back. Things were really, really bad. He was from a place called Naberezhny Cherny, which is in Tatarstan, 500 miles east of Moscow. And anyway, Stas came back, but it was because of Chuck RItchie that Stas came back. He wanted to go to Orono, and they said, we can't have anybody that's not on a program. So Chuck wrote Stasia a scholarship, and he said, we always have students here, we'd be happy to have him back. He wrote all the paperwork, got Stas back. Now, that was in 1995, that's what, 20-some years ago? And now Stas is no longer a Russian citizen, he's an American citizen. He is a doctor, an internal medicine doctor, practicing in Michigan. And had it not been for Chuck RItchie and his helping Stas along the way through school, that it just wouldn't have happened. And so you've made a big change in our lives. I thank you for that. Some of the stories that we get are after he was here. He would never pick up the phone because the phone was always bad news. He was convinced that somebody was going to come get him because he was supposed to go into the Russian army as soon as he finished high school. And I would say, let's call your parents. Oh, no, I don't want to call my parents. It's bad news. But he did, I made him. And the Russian army was looking for him all the time. They would show up at 3 o'clock in the morning and banging on the door saying, where is your son? They were convinced that he was hiding from them. And that was a common thing. Nobody wanted to go into the Russian army because it was a bad place to be, and it was extremely primitive. And I have something I wanted to give you. It's goes back 20 years. One of his friends who went into the army, and things were documented, and I don't know what to do with it. But anyway, there are young 18, 19-year-old Russian kids who are being sent into this, who have really no desire to be there. And I've having had a kid who was in that kind of a circumstance, boy, I feel sorry for these young Russians too who are getting thrown into a war.
There are 4 kids that we've worked with in Chita, one of which is still just finishing his basic, and there are 3 others that have come out of their basic training, are in the reserve. And the people that we work with over there are just absolutely fearful that here's a key element that keep your eye out for, and it's mobilization. The word has come up. But if he mobilizes, it means that just as you're speaking, and the 4 kids that I know that we've been working with, they will go, and they have no choice. So But I did read an article that said, mobilization, again, the Russian army, the whole mobilization process has been kind of, it's fallen apart because they haven't used it. And the people that they would need to train these new recruits coming in through mobilization are the ones that are out fighting on the front line. So mobilization isn't necessarily a given. But if they do choose, that's going to be another indication that Putin is going to push this thing down the line even more. So you guys got places to go.
Yeah, thank you to Chuck. Big hand for Chuck.